NATO has finally entered the Ukraine battlefield. No, it's not sending troops yet, but NATO tanks are rolling into Ukraine. The deliveries have begun, plus NATO is inching closer to the Russian border. It is expanding. Finland is set to join the alliance. The decks have been cleared, and this only means that the challenges for Russia are mounting. And it's happening with the onset of spring. Perfect timing for Ukraine to launch an offensive. How is Russia gearing up to respond to this? It is replenishing its own arsenal and stitching more defense partnerships. The latest one in the picture is North Korea. Russia is getting defense supplies from North Korea. That's what the Americans say, that Moscow will give food to Pyongyang in exchange for weapons. The deal, if it happens, will be a violation of UN resolutions. But we're way past that, way past following rules here. The West tried to corner Russia with sanctions. Russia has got a veto power plus diplomatic cover from China, and now its goal is to turn this advantage into territorial gains. So who has the upper hand in the war? Let's start with the latest. After weeks of waiting, Ukraine is finally getting the tanks it wanted. The Leopard tanks from Germany and the Challenger tanks from Britain. The UK is sending a total of 14 tanks. Germany has shared 18.
We
stand by Ukraine, which we support politically, financially, but also with arms deliveries and especially with the military training that both our countries provide. Germany and the Netherlands have jointly delivered armored infantry fighting vehicles and ammunition and are currently preparing, together with Denmark, the delivery of Leopard 1 main battle tanks.
Very modern tanks, he says. Germany was initially reluctant, but under pressure from US and allies, it relented and agreed to share tanks with Ukraine. Earlier, Norway had sent 8 tanks. What about the US? It hasn't made any deliveries yet. Last week, the US promised to speed up.
In close coordination with Ukraine, has made the decision to provide the M1A1 variant of the Abrams tank, which will enable us to significantly expedite delivery timelines and deliver this important capability to Ukraine by the fall of this year. It will also give Ukraine a very similar capability to the M1A2, which includes advanced armor and weapon systems to include a 120-millimeter cannon and 50-caliber heavy machine gun.
How many tanks will America give Ukraine? Reports say at least 31. And how many tanks will Ukraine get in total? Kiev is expecting at least 120 tanks in the first wave. And how will it use them? In combat missions. Ukraine says they'll begin very soon. The tanks will boost its defenses and the morale of its troops. Before sending them to the front lines, Ukraine's defense minister took the tanks out for a spin. He released these videos showing off the NATO tanks. If social media posts could win a war, Ukraine would have bagged it by now. But that's not how it works. And unfortunately for Ukraine, Russia is intensifying the attacks. There's no breakthrough in Bakhmut yet. Today, Russia targeted Kharkiv in the northeast. Russian forces unleashed drone and missile strikes. Civilian infrastructure was targeted. Reports say Russia launched the missiles from the S-300. Also, Iranian drones were in the sky. And what is Zelensky doing? He's giving interviews. This week, he spoke to the Associated Press. Ukraine's president was asked about Bakhmut. This is a city in the east where Ukrainians and Russians have been fighting for months. Many lives have been lost, but neither side is ready to give up. Zelensky says he won't allow Putin a win on the battlefield.
Is this part of why you are fighting so hard in Bakhmut? Because a lot of military analysts will say that strategically it's not that significant.
Because that will be victory for him. He will.
And any victory.
Yes, he will sell this victory. He will sell this victory to West, to his society, to China, to Iran, to all the countries.
That is Zelensky's fear. He claims Putin will use a win in Bakhmut as leverage and push for a deal that will heavily favor the Russians. But Washington has a different assessment. It says Putin is not preparing for a negotiation. He's ramping up his military supplies. The US says Russia is sending a delegation to North Korea. They will offer food to the North Koreans, and in return, they'll get weapons. In fact, let me quote from what the White House has said. As part of this proposed deal, Russia would receive over 24 kinds of weapons and munitions from Pyongyang. We also understand that Russia is seeking to send a delegation to North Korea and that Russia is offering North Korea food in exchange for munitions. The idea is not far-fetched, but remember the West made similar claims about China too, that China will arm the Russians. That hasn't happened yet. So far, Beijing has only supplied dual-use equipment to Moscow. Dual-use are goods that are meant for civilian use but can also be repurposed by the military. The Chinese have not sent any lethal arms yet. This month, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Russia. He presented his much-hyped peace plan. Putin supported it. The West rejected it. What about Ukraine? Zelensky did say that he wants to talk to Xi Jinping. And they were supposed to talk to each other, but it hasn't happened yet. Zelensky is still waiting for the phone to ring.
Of course, I gave all the diplomatic and public and not public to President of China, to leader of China, and I want to speak with him because I had contact with him before full-scale war.
Meanwhile, China's defense ministry says it's looking to increase military cooperation with Russia. The statement came yesterday. China said it would join hands with Russia to promote world peace. And I'm not making this up. The statement made no mention of military supplies. Either way, Beijing is firmly in Moscow's camp. It has been backing Russia in a steady yet limited fashion. And despite Xi Jinping's desire to be seen as peacemaker, there is no peace in sight. The war has completed 401 days, and both sides are adding to their arsenal to continue fighting. The war in Ukraine has tested Russia. The West claims the Russian state is weak, but that's just their spin. The fact is, the Russian state is not just alive, it is growing its military power. Putin's war machine is getting new upgrades. A massive leak has revealed fresh details. More than 5,000 documents have come out. They show how Russia is making serious strides in cyber warfare. Moscow now has a range of capabilities, from launching social media disinformation attacks to disrupting real-world targets remotely, like sea, air, and rail-controlled systems. At the center of this is a Moscow-based defense contractor. It's called NTC Vulcan. And what does it do? It makes software to launch cyber attacks. It works in tandem with the Russian military. But NTC Vulcan is just one cog in the giant wheel of Russian cyber power. Russia has put in place a robust system of hackers, of agents, and private players like Vulcan. Together, they identify critical targets and enemy vulnerabilities. Then they go after them. How do they work together? The Russian state security has three main programs: Amizit, Shkan, and Crystal 2. Each of these has specific roles. Amizit and Shkan enable social media disinformation campaigns. They also map out targets that can be hacked. The third platform, Crystal 2, is for high-stakes operations. And these are real-world attacks, the kind that can target critical infrastructure of adversaries. And who are these efforts directed towards? The leaked documents identify the potential targets, and there are no surprises on this front. Russia is directing its cyber activities towards the West, mainly the United States and Europe. That's where Russia's potential targets are. So we have the Russian state that identifies and sponsors these activities. There is NTC Vulcan that makes the tools for cyber warfare. And the third part of this equation are Russia's cyber warriors, the group of hackers that carries out these attacks. The leaked papers identify the cyber warriors too. It names a group called Sandworm. It's a hacking group, a unit of the Russian military, Sandworm. They have a code name, 74455. Tools made by Vulcan have ended up in the hands of Sandworm. And where have they been used? We cannot say for sure, but in the past, Sandworm has been blamed for several high-profile cyber attacks, like the disruption during the 2018 Winter Olympics. South Korea had hosted that event in 2018. There was a malware attack during the opening ceremony. It took out the internet. The cyber attack stopped telecasts. It grounded the drones used by broadcasters. The official website of the games was shut down, and spectators could not print out their reservations. Sandworm was blamed for this disruption. They have struck in Ukraine too in 2017. This was the NotPetya attack. One of the most devastating cyber attacks in history. It crippled ports, it paralyzed corporations and froze government agencies. Experts say this attack was initially aimed at Ukraine, but the impact was worldwide. Do you know how much damage it caused? More than $10 billion. Sandworm is also believed to have caused power blackouts in Ukraine at least twice. Reports say Sandworm is now actively supporting the Russian invasion. All these details are part of the Vulcan files. Clearly, the Russian state has aced this new frontier. Experts say Moscow is intensifying these efforts now. Instances of cyber attacks are growing, and the new targets are Kiev's European allies. How will Ukraine and the West counter this? Keep watching this space. Meanwhile, celebrations are on in Finland. The country is set to become the latest NATO member. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, a military alliance that is led by the US. Finland had been trying to join for months, and finally it can. That's because Turkey has given the green light. It was the last hurdle. NATO has 30 members, including Turkey, and all members must agree before a new country is allowed to join. So the decks have been cleared for Finland to join. It will formally be inducted in the next NATO meeting. That's in July this year. But remember, Finland was not the only country that wanted to join NATO. Sweden applied too at the same time. Both these Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, have been traditionally neutral. But they decided to join the NATO camp after Russia invaded Ukraine last year. This is what some Finns had to say.
Well, I believe that in this kind of environment, political environment nowadays, I believe that there is definitely strength in numbers, and there is good opportunity now that we can all be united under this NATO banner, and no longer maybe be under any kind of threats.
I think it would be good. I mean, we get more international connections, and it could really help Finland if Russia would decide to do something, for example. It could be really good for Finland.
Both Finland and Sweden decided to seek NATO protection against possible Russian aggression, because NATO has a rule. An attack on one member is an attack on all. So NATO is like a security insurance, and membership would prevent a Ukraine-like situation where the West can help, but only indirectly. So these countries, Finland and Sweden, wanted to join, but they faced two roadblocks, Hungary and Turkey. Both have leaders that the West considers problematic. Hungary's Viktor Orban and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And Erdogan, in particular, has been using the Nordic countries as political pawns. He blocked their entry to the NATO. Why would Erdogan do this? He's been in power for 2 decades using authoritarian tactics. He started as Prime Minister of Turkey in 2004, then became President in 2014. In 2018, he abolished the position of Prime Minister and became President again. He's basically been making changes to Turkey's government to extend his reign, and that's just one of the problems that Western democracies have with him. Then there are his ties to Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin shares good relations with Erdogan. This is despite the war in Ukraine. Just yesterday, Erdogan said Putin could visit Turkey next month. This is to inaugurate the country's first nuclear power reactor. The reactor was built by a Russian energy company, and Putin may inaugurate it. Erdogan has also refused to back Western sanctions on Moscow. In fact, Turkey has been helping Russia evade those very same sanctions. Then they went ahead and bought the Russian S-400 missile defense systems. This led to a lot of heartburn in NATO, a NATO member buying Russian defense equipment. The US sanctioned Turkey for this, but Erdogan did not budge. And the Russian S-400s have been arriving in Turkey since 2019. So there's a lot of tension really between Turkey and its NATO allies. Then why is the West still listening to Erdogan? Why can't they just boot Turkey out of NATO? Because like most other things, it's complicated. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, just 3 years after the alliance was formed. It has been a steady partner over the years. Even today, Turkish drones are helping Ukraine in the war. Turkey also has the manpower that NATO needs. Its armed forces are the second largest in NATO. France comes third, and Turkey is said to have more than double the troops of France. American forces make up the bulk of NATO troops, but Turkey is also essential. And Erdogan knows all of this, which is why he continues to play his politics. He blocked the entry of Nordic nations, saying they allow anti-Turkey activities. Both Sweden and Finland. They have Turkish dissidents and Kurds who want to break away from Turkey. Erdogan calls them terrorists. Some of these groups are also part of an attempted coup in Turkey in 2016. Basically, Recep Tayyip Erdogan has an axe to grind with these people. He says Sweden should deport them. Only then will he allow Sweden to join NATO. He had similar issues with Finland too, but apparently they have been resolved. Erdogan praised what he called Finland's authentic and concrete steps on Turkish security. And that's why the Turkish parliament ratified Finland's membership yesterday.
The approval of the protocol for ratification of Finland to join NATO as follows. Vote 276, approved 276. As the Parliament of Turkey, we congratulate the state and the people of Finland. The bill proposed was approved.
Erdogan's politics aside, Finland joining NATO is a blow to Putin. For years, he's used military intervention to destabilize neighbors who wanted to join NATO, like Georgia in 2008. And Ukraine from 2014 till date. So Erdogan's green light to Finland will definitely upset Moscow. But he's doing a balancing act. He's looking after his own interests, essentially. After all, he has an election to face in less than 2 months.